With us now, we've got former Secretary of State John Kerry. He's out with a sweeping new memoir entitled Every Day is Extra. And I couldn't help, as I was looking through the book and looking at some of the pictures of some of the more important moments in your life. There, of course, is a picture of you with Ted Kennedy, but also a picture with another senator and a man who you had some strong disagreements with, because everybody had strong disagreements with him. But you guys ended up being friends and doing some great things together. John McCain, what are your thoughts?
Well, we miss him already, but the example is extraordinary. A lot of people suggested we may not see the likes of a John McCain again, perhaps not in the context of war and prisoner of war, but we need to see senators and congressmen standing up today. I mean, I can't think of a moment where it is more important for people to do their duty, which they have not been doing. Everybody in Washington, Joe, knows what's going on. And it's the chatter. I've heard you guys talk about how you've heard these things for months. You know, what Bob Woodward's book has done is sort of confirm and put together. What I think our books are actually complementary, and I'm not trying to reach. Bob lays out the problem, but I think this book shows you how America came through really tough times and how we can solve the problem by doing our jobs.
So that's what I would ask you about. Again, a follow-up on your relationship with John McCain. It seems that is an example of where this country needs to go, because for those who didn't go through Vietnam, you certainly went through it, and John McCain went through it more personally than almost everybody else. You guys were on the opposite sides in that debate. He came back thinking that you had undermined America's effort. You thought that the war was wrong-headed in many ways. And yet, again, on the most divisive issue of our time, you guys forged a consensus, went over together, and helped normalize relations with Vietnam.
Well, that's why I think, honestly, Joe, I think that's why what I've tried to write is it's not a policy tome. It's a personal journey, personal story about America, about a young guy who grew up in the Cold War and who's felt as the son of the greatest generation, you have to go serve. So John McCain and I came to the war from the same place. And in an epic flight we had together where we weirdly didn't know each other. We didn't trust each other. We talked into the night. Everybody else was sleeping, and we talked on that plane, and we agreed. The country's still divided over Vietnam. We haven't made peace here at home, let alone in Vietnam. So we decided to work on it together, and we really got to know each other. We traveled back to Vietnam together. In a moment I describe in the book, I mean, I stood in John McCain's cell with John McCain, alone, just the two of us. And I thought about the journey we'd made together where we said, we're going to make peace with Vietnam, we're going to make peace in America. And there we were, these two guys who did come from completely polar opposites. But we found common ground, and there we were in Hanoi, of all places, in his cell, sharing that common ground. It was a very, very moving moment and inspirational to me.
I want to ask you about the op-ed in the New York Times. Having served in an administration, you know well how these things work, but we have a president who is breaking norms by the day. Aren't there consequences to hearing reports like we're hearing in Bob Woodward's book, like we're reading about in the New York Times, members of the administration breaking norms in return?
No. It's really part of our constitutional process and part of the right of any American to speak out. And you take the consequences when you do. Go back again, this is part of the history. Daniel Ellsberg, people who saw a higher responsibility to country. What bothers me about this moment right now is everybody in Washington does know this. All the Republicans know this. They know Donald Trump is not competent, is not capable of performing the responsibilities of president. And it has enormous consequences. Richard knows what leaders in other countries are sitting around talking to each other about now. If you're a Putin or you're a Xi, you're engaged in the One Belt, One Road project with $1 trillion being spent in 68 countries, and you look at the United States and say, boy, this is our opportunity. Let's drive it to the hilt. We have an opportunity loss cost in what is happening now. And nobody's reckoning that in Washington. The members of the United States Senate, this is what the Senate was defined for, this moment. And it is a moment that calls on them to do things that are necessary to stopgap what Donald Trump is either not doing or not capable of doing. Right. And there are a whole bunch of things, I think. But the biggest single opportunity we have right now, I think, is 2018. We can have a course correction in our own democracy that actually revitalizes our democracy. And again, I write about that in the book. I mean, go back to 1971, 72. 71 is when I protested the war. Richard Nixon was very popular then. He carried 49 states in 72. 1 year later, he was gone. Why? Because people did their jobs. The institutions that were there stood up and resisted. When I look at this memo, it says that when the New York Times says senior, they mean senior. And they would not have published this because they know the consequences if they didn't have confidence. They know who it is. And I think we have to therefore understand the implications of what this person has done. Would I prefer, as others here would, that it were public? Sure. But it doesn't diminish the consequence of it. Yeah.
What ought to be, Secretary Kerry, the message of Democrats? 2018, you've seen some, you saw Ayanna Pressley winning in Massachusetts, for example, knocking off
worked for me for 15 years.
Is that right?
Lady. She's a great lady.
Knocking off a 20-year incumbent there. What is the, I know it's district by district, but what's the message, if it's not just anti-Donald Trump, what is the Democrats' message? What cuts through this?
Well, the message absolutely shouldn't be just Donald Trump. Everybody understands this. We're wasting too much time on the tweets and on the daily bloviating, frankly. We've got to talk about America's agenda. We have to offer a better way of meeting the needs of the American people. Citizens on the right, citizens on the left are equally angry at their lot in life because their needs are not being met. And when you have 52% of America's income going to 1% of Americans, you have an unsustainable political equation. Everybody in America knows this. And the reason you went from Gingrich Revolution to Tea Party to Freedom Caucus to Donald Trump and a hostile takeover of the Republican Party was frustration with the lack of adequate response. So we have in 2 months a referendum on Donald Trump, on all of this. But it won't work if we're not offering America a way to show the institutions can work, how they work. And again, I come back to the book. I think I show in the book again and again how the Senate could work. Right. What it was like when I came there in the 1980s, when it was functioning and we were able to get things done. We balanced the budget in the 1990s, folks. And here we are with a completely dysfunctional Washington that also is living in a kind of insidious corruption that comes from the money in American politics and the unwillingness of people to perform their constitutional responsibility.
Well, let's talk about what happens when you disagree with the executive, when you disagree with the President of the United States. And let's talk about Syria. And you gave a speech in the summer of 3 summers ago about the need to take on Syria, the red line, the whole thing, and everything like that. That evening, the day that you gave the speech, the President of the United States walks around the South Lawn with Dennis McDonough, the Chief of Staff, and they change the direction that you were taking. What happens internally when you disagree with a decision made by the President?
Well, Michael, I think it depends on what the consequence of the decision is. On occasion, you may feel you have to resign, as Cyrus Vance did when a decision was made in Desert One when they tried to make a rescue in the hostages and it failed. Different moments, different consequences. In this case, it wasn't a reversal of the direction we were going. It was a decision by the President to try to get Congress to participate in it. And that was a fair decision by any president to make, particularly 1 or 2 days after the Prime Minister of England had gone to Parliament for that very reason, and it failed in Parliament. So that augmented the need to say, whoa, if it failed there, there's all the more reason to feel you have to have the support of the American people. We believed, Joe Biden believed, I believed, the President believed, and most of us believed. I think Susan Rice was the only one who got it right, that Congress wouldn't do something. We thought Congress would support it rapidly. And we were wrong. We miscalculated that. So what happens, I think, you do your best to implement a legitimate policy of the President of the United States, one that made sense in that moment, but obviously cost us ultimately because of the way it played out.
I also want to raise Syria, and when you were Secretary of State, because here we are meeting today, and 2.5, 3 million Syrians now are living on death's door. We're about to see the final offensive where the government, helped by Iran and Russia, is going to crush, quite possibly, the opposition that's remaining, and millions of innocent people, their lives are at risk. When you look back over the last 7 or 8 years of Syria, what lessons should we take about what the United States did, but also the consequences of what we didn't do? How, because right now...
Well, Syria is one of the few greatest scars that exists in the world today in terms of the international community's failure to step up together to find a solution. I think there is a solution. I think we put it on the table in UN Resolution 2254, which all countries, including Iran, including Russia, including China, and including the countries who are the neighbors, Turkey, etc., all agreed on a way to be able to resolve Syria by letting the people of Syria elect a new president under a very accountable election run by the international community, which would bring the opposition in to participate. I mean, everybody accepted that. The problem is we didn't have any leverage to be able to deal with Assad himself, and he kept breaking it all the time. And the Russians didn't stand up and hold him accountable. So what is the lesson? I write in the book about how I believe we needed to step in and exercise authority that showed we were willing to hold him accountable, notwithstanding the Russians.
Including the use of military force.
Including the use of force, particularly the use of force. If he was going to fly his airplanes and drop barrel bombs on Aleppo, and we said this was against the norms of behavior, we had to back up those norms of behavior. And I'm very clear about it in the book. We had a disagreement on that, but I thought it was a different way to approach it.
So, Mr. Secretary, in Every Day is Extra, you detail how you came back from Vietnam, a disillusioned young man. And I just wonder what you believe the message is from this book to young Americans today who may be disillusioned in politics, whether they are liberals who can't believe what happened in 2016, or young conservatives who can't believe what happened in 2016, or young independents who look at both sides and say, no thanks, I'm checking out of the system. Earlier, you talked about how quickly things changed between November 72 and August 74. Yeah. What's your message to them?
My message is that they hear the words from politicians, but they don't always believe them, that each individual can really make a difference. That's exactly what happened back then. Earth Day, 20 million people come out. They translate it into a movement that made the issue a voting issue. And they targeted the 12 worst votes in Congress, labeled them the Dirty Dozen, and 7 of the 12 lost their seats. Guess what happened? Clean Air Act passed, safe drinking water, marine mammal protection, coastal zone management, EPA, signed into law by Richard Nixon. Young people made that happen. That happened because of people who took a semester off from college, the peanut butter and jelly brigades in New Hampshire, who elevated Gene McCarthy. I mean, all of it came from this energy for the peace movement, for women, for the equal rights amendment. All these things were happening. And then once some of those things were accomplished, people sort of went to sleep and backed off. We have to rejuvenate, re-energize our own democracy in this country. We have to make it work. Here's the magic number, 54.2. 54.2% of eligible Americans voted in 2016. When I ran in 2004, the eligible vote was 60.4%. When Barack Obama was elected in 2008, it was 62.3%. And then it dropped down in the re-elect to 58%. You know the last time it was 54.2%? Al Gore. So the lesson is, it's not the people who did vote who elected Donald Trump, it's people who didn't vote. Young people need to understand the importance of the vote. Historically, they don't always turn out. And we have to motivate people to understand. Climate change. I can't think of an issue that will motivate. We're heading towards 4 degrees centigrade in this century. It will be absolutely catastrophic for refugees, crops, water. I mean, we're already seeing the consequences. Hottest 10 years in recorded history. Last year, the hottest year in history. The 10 years before that, the second hottest 10 years, the 10 years before that, the third hottest 10 years. Isn't there a message from that somewhere? when President Xi, President Putin, President Macron, all these people are adhering to the Paris Agreement, and only Donald Trump, without a shred of evidence, without a shred of scientific fact, pulls out. These are the issues that I believe will motivate people, and over the next 2 months, whether it's health care or education or opportunity or fair wages, we have a message. And we need to take that out and get young people to organize around it.
The memoir is titled Every Day is Extra. Former Secretary of State John Kerry, thank you very much. And Richard Haass, thank you as well. Very good to see you.
We're going to be replaying your testimony today.
The ratings will.
May 39, the whole, right?
That's right.
Yes. All right. Still
Really my
ahead.
response.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Still ahead, former Vice President Joe Biden hits the campaign trail and appears to take a shot at Hillary Clinton. We'll show you that moment ahead on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.